So here we go. Hi everyone. So we have another fantastic MuM-PreDiCT webinar for you, and I'm really pleased to welcome Hannah Lynes to join us this evening. So as a new mum, Hannah saw at first hand many of the challenges that mothers and babies experience, and she had moved into breastfeeding support. And her journey has taken her through roles as a Maternity Voices Partnership Chair, and National Childbirth Trust Breastfeeding Counsellor, National Maternity Voices Chair, and a Company Director at Better Breastfeeding. And through these roles, Hannah has gained experience in co-production, committee chairing, advocacy, and strategy writing. So picking up an awful lot of useful skills along the way. So Hannah, I'm going to turn my camera off and it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for inviting me to do this webinar. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you for everyone who's joined to hear my story. I've been asked to share my journey in patient and public involvement and engagement, and I've got 20 to 25 minutes to do it in. And this is a journey that has been 16 years. So I've found it really hard to work out how on earth I'm going to fit it into that time, and I'm sure I've got too much to say. So I'm just going to do my best, and I'm going to try and share how my journey's evolved, how I kind of got from the start to where I am now, and how one thing's led to another. This account is only going to be as accurate as my memory, and I'm really aware that this has been such a busy 16 years with so much that's happened for me personally as well as professionally. I'm quite sure that I'm going to get some things wrong, and there are people here who might actually know that I've got things wrong as well. So I hope people will correct me if there's anything that I've misremembered, or will tell me afterwards, and I'll do my best to correct anything. But I'm going to give you as accurate a perspective as I can, and I'm going to try and give it not just the high points, but also things that didn't work as well, and so that you get a kind of accurate reflection of what this journey's been like for me. And it's also, the other thing I found really hard is the terminology, because so much terminology has changed during this period, quite often multiple times. So I'm going to try and use the wording that was relevant at the time when the thing happened, but I'll try and tell you how that links to current terminology as well. So these are just some of the things that, as Rachel said, that I'll be kind of talking about during this webinar. So where did it start? I think this picture was the closest one I could find to where my journey started. So this is me with my first baby when he was about 6 months old, which I think is when I started to get involved in service user voice things. And so you could probably draw lots of conclusions about me from this picture already. This is where I'm a first-time mother. I gave birth. I had a cesarean birth, which I didn't feel very happy about. That wasn't the birth I wanted to have. And I'm breastfeeding my son, and that is something that I'm happy about. That was something I did want to do. My background at this point, I grew up in London. I went to a comprehensive school in central London, which was extremely socially and culturally diverse. Came from quite an activist family. I learned from my parents that if there's something that's wrong, then you try and change it. I went to Oxford University and I studied philosophy, politics and economics there. And then I did various professional roles relating to government policy. And the longest one was that I worked for Help the Hospices, which was a national charity for the hospice movement. And so, yeah, so here's me having had my first baby. And I think the first thing that I did, was I was sort of involved with the NCT because I'd been to antenatal classes, and I heard they were doing a VBAC evening, which was vaginal birth after cesarean, and I was interested in that because I'd had a cesarean, and I thought if I had another birth I would prefer not to have another one. So I went to that evening and I started asking questions about why there's so many cesarean births in our area. It seems quite high, and could we do something about that? And also, while we're about that, can we do something about breastfeeding support? Because although I was breastfeeding at this point, it hadn't all been totally straightforward, and I'd also seen how other mothers that I knew pretty much by this point, 6 months, they'd all pretty much stopped breastfeeding, and a lot of them before they wanted to. So I was kind of quite motivated to think, well, could we do something to improve breastfeeding support? And I had a feeling that that was quite an important, that the way we parent could be quite important in terms of our society as a whole and solving a lot of the problems that we have. So I was starting to think about all these things, and the response of the chair of the NCT branch to all of these questions was to put me in contact with someone who was the chair of the local MSLC. And I got a response from the chair of the MSLC, and she said this to me. She said, Hannah, it would be great to have more user involvement at the MSLC meetings. We meet every other month for 2 hours on a Tuesday or Thursday, 1 to 3 p.m. Progress is quite slow, but improvements can come about with a bit of campaigning. Do give me a ring if you're interested in finding out more. So obviously that was a great invitation for me and something that I was keen to get involved in. And here's me with my baby at around this time, about 9 months, where I then started attending MVP meetings. And that was really great for me because I started to understand a bit more how things worked locally and to meet people. And I would, if I was meeting other mums, I'd get their feedback and share it with the MVP chair, and she might bring that up at the meeting. It was all voluntary, of course, there's no payment for that role. And I was the only service user who ever went, apart from some NCT practitioners. There was no creche or anything like that, so it was just me turning up with my baby. Another thing I did around that time was to coordinate a letter from the local NCT branches to the local NHS trust, because I was interested in breastfeeding support, and I'd noticed on the UNICEF website, UNICEF runs something called the Baby Friendly Initiative, which is an accreditation programme that hospital trusts can sign up to, and then it takes them through improving the support that they provide for mothers with infant feeding. And I noticed that on the UNICEF website, my local trust, not only was it not yet at stage 1 or stage 2 or stage 3 like lots of the others were, but it hadn't even expressed its intent to start working towards those. It kind of said something like declined to express intent or something. So I thought that was quite shocking, and so I contacted the chair of my old chair of my NCT branch again, and got her to coordinate with the other NCT chairs in the area. And they wrote to the chief executive of our local hospital and got a response, which was quite a positive response, where actually the hospital was saying, actually, we are going to start thinking about this. So that was a positive thing. And I think as a result of me doing this sort of thing, when the hospital set up their baby friendly steering group, the MVP chair put me forward to be the service user rep on that group. So that was another group then that I started to attend. And the main thing that I remember from attending those meetings was that my son was getting a little bit older and he'd learnt to crawl. And that was starting to get a bit tricky, because in those meetings, it was mainly women in the meetings, and they would all have a handbag next to their chair, and he would be crawling around under the table, emptying out everyone's handbags. So I used to make him his own handbag to take with him to the meetings. That's not the actual bag, but I replicated it this morning so you could have a picture. But I used to do something like that, with like full of toys. And the other thing I used to do was buy him a toy on the way that he was a new toy, so he'd have something that would engage him during the meeting. And one time I remember I got what I thought was a quiet toy, and it turned out to be this bus that had like an internal motor, and he spent the whole meeting with this like vroom, vroom, vroom. So I wasn't very popular on that occasion, but at the end of the day, they wanted my input and they weren't paying me, and there was no creche. So the other great thing about attending those meetings was that I met someone called Jean Ray, and she ran the milk bank in the hospital, and she was also an NCT tutor, and she trained breastfeeding counsellors. And one day she approached me and said, Hannah, I wonder if you've thought about training to be a breastfeeding counsellor, because obviously she could see I was still breastfeeding my 1-year-old, and so she thought that might interest me, and it did interest me. But I was at the point there where I was about to start going back to work, I don't like that use of the term work because obviously I've been working very hard as a mother, but going back to paid work. And so it wasn't really the right time. I went back to paid work and it worked for a while, but after a while I felt like it wasn't really working for my son. And so I ended up taking a career break, which essentially was me becoming an at-home mum in September 2010 when my son was 2. And that was not at all where I expected myself to end up. I never in a million years would have thought I was going to be an at-home mum. I thought I was really career-minded, and that was quite a hard decision for me, but it was the right decision at that time, and it was possible because my husband had started a business, and so it was something I was able to do. So having taken that decision to become an at-home mum, the natural thing was for me to then get back in contact with Jean and say, yes, I would like to train to be a breastfeeding counsellor. And that was something I started in November 2010. So I then had a second baby in July 2011. That's me with him. There we are in the sling again. This was quite a full-on period for me because I had that new baby. I still had my older son, and I was doing this training to be a breastfeeding counsellor, which turned out to be a bit more full on than I had expected. And so I think I took a break from service user voice work during that period when I was doing that. And in fact, the local MSLC was revamped in 2013. That was the year that I qualified to be a breastfeeding counsellor. And I was contacted by Pauline Cross, who had been commissioned to revamp the MSLC. And I think she was kind of asking if I might be interested in taking on the chair role for that new committee, but I didn't feel able to do that at that point. There was just too much going on for me. But I was able to put Pauline Cross in contact with Laura James, who was a local antenatal teacher, and I knew that she was potentially interested in getting involved in the MSLC. And that was great because Laura turned out to be a fantastic MSLC chair. So Pauline had done an amazing job of re-establishing the MSLC, the Maternity Services Liaison Committee, and then Laura had taken it forward, and she was just brilliant and inspired confidence of everyone that she worked with, and she put so much effort in, much of it unpaid, to get that committee up and running. My second son started school in September 2015, and I think that was then when I had a bit more time. I actually had a bad back for a while at that point, so it was really, I think, 2016 when I felt able to get back involved in the MSLC, and the committee that I rejoined was so transformed from the committee that I had previously attended. And that's not at all a comment on the previous chair had also been fantastic, but I think she'd been entirely unpaid, and this new committee had a budget, and you know, it had been kind of rejuvenated, and it was really a new committee. So during that time, I also was getting back to doing a bit of advocacy, particularly around breastfeeding, because I'd had that bad back. I'd had an MRI scan, and I'd been told I would need to stop breastfeeding for a while to have the MRI scan. And I looked at all the evidence, and that wasn't really true. You didn't really have to do that. And so I started Googling what all the different hospital policies were, and I decided to write this blog post about just linking to all the different hospital policies on MRI scans and breastfeeding, and I showed how they were all different and a lot of them weren't evidence-based. That was all I did, but it got me in touch with various interesting people. Wendy Jones at the Breastfeeding Network, incredible woman who's devoted her life to making available accurate information about medication and breastfeeding. And someone called Florence Wilcott referred to this blog post. She's an obstetrician, another amazing woman, and she wrote a blog post for BMJ online, British Medical Journal, where she referred to this blog post. And this blog post is still there on my blog, and I still get quite a few visits to it, which suggests women are probably still being told that they need to pause breastfeeding in order to have an MRI scan. Which is a shame, but I think there has been some improvement. I have updated it a couple of times over the years, and I think there are improvements. I need to update it again now. I'm sure it's not up to date at the moment. And another thing I did as a service user, but with that kind of experience that I'd started to get as a breastfeeding counsellor, I had really a difficult time with my children who had early childhood caries. They had tooth decay when they were really young. And it was really hard being a breastfeeding mother going to the dentist with children with tooth decay, because they would all blame breastfeeding and blame me essentially for breastfeeding them and tell me I had to stop breastfeeding, etc. And so I did this little bit of what I think counts as research probably, where I just looked at Mumsnet and NetMums, and I searched on keywords of dentist and breastfeeding, and then I just wrote an analysis of what mothers were saying about their experience of talking to dentists about breastfeeding, and that was published in Perspective, which was the journal for NCT practitioners. I think it's probably the only time I've had something published in a professional journal, so that was an interesting thing that I worked on. So the next thing that happened to me was that Laura James decided that it was time for her to step down as chair of Bromley MSLC, and none of the long-standing volunteers wanted to take on that role, so she approached me and said, what did I think about becoming an MSLC chair? And I thought about it a bit, and I asked Laura about what extent did she think this was a role where you could really make a difference, and she said she really thought it was, and she gave me examples of what she had been able to do. And it was an interesting one, because to me it was like a little bit of a diversion. I was kind of really focused on breastfeeding, and this was like a slightly broader thing about maternity services as a whole. But it was quite a good time for me because my children had started school, and I'd got over my bad back, and I kind of had settled into the breastfeeding counsellor role. I did have a bit of time, so I said yes, and I was elected to be chair of the MSLC in September 2016, and that was a role that I started in January 2017. And I inherited a fantastically thriving committee, thriving to the point where Bromley Maternity Voices, as it had become known, our MSLC, was featured in implementing Better Births, which so Better Births had been published in February 2016, and that was the report of the National Maternity Review, which had been chaired by Baroness Julia Cumberledge. And then implementing Better Births was guidance to local maternity systems about how they should, what they needed to do, and it included a whole chapter which Laura was involved in writing, which was about moving from maternity services liaison committees, MSLCs, to Maternity Voices Partnerships, MVPs. And Bromley Maternity Voices was featured as the example of an MSLC that was working well in that guidance. So that was a testament to the work that Pauline and then Laura had done to establish that committee. So taking on this role, following in Laura's footsteps, was quite overwhelming in some ways. I mean, what an opportunity to take the lead of this committee, but also quite daunting in some ways to take this on. I absolutely loved the fact that I found myself at the centre of this kind of community group and able to make all these connections, which was brilliant. But it was also quite like, as I remember it, my first week, just kind of getting all these emails and being like, whoa, this is like this whole thing that I'm now responsible for. And this is me when I had just taken on the role at the London MVP Development Day. And this is a quote from Florence Wilcock, who I mentioned before. This is a tweet from her, sorry. And I was talking about what it was like to step into those shoes of Laura James and trying to do this role. And this day was also important for me because this was the day when I went and introduced myself to Ayala Ockett. And I'm going to talk more about Ayala Ockett later, but I'm just mentioning her now because this was an example of where being in a place for a particular purpose gave me the opportunity to meet someone. And Ayala was someone I'd come across online, and I knew she was putting together a guide to the guidance on breastfeeding, so like trying to bring together all the national guidance on breastfeeding into one place, and that was something I'd been interested in from what I'd been doing locally and in terms of like breastfeeding support. So I went and introduced myself to her. And here we are. So this is Bromley Maternity Voices. This was a fairly typical committee meeting. This was one of the ones we had in the hospital. So we also had more informal ones that were in the children's centres, but some of our meetings we had in the hospital, and you can see me there as the chair of the committee. My role involved putting together the papers for the meetings and chairing these meetings. It involved sometimes representing the committee or finding a service user voice rep to represent service users at various meetings in the hospital. It involved also representing the Maternity Voices Partnership at the local maternity system at their meetings. And I also became the service user rep on the local maternity system's public health working group. I also coordinated Walk the Patch, so it wasn't necessarily me that did that, but it might be another volunteer, but sometimes it would be me. And that meant we went into the hospital and we spoke to women on the maternity ward about their experience, and we wrote up their feedback, and that went to the staff providing the service, and they were able to make changes on the basis of that. And it also came to the Maternity Voices Partnership as well for us to consider. We also had coffee mornings, and these are some photos from one of our coffee mornings that we had in people's houses. We did some ad hoc projects. I also responded to inquiries and did the social media and coordinating volunteers. I was paid 4 days a month at the patient and public voice rate, which is £150 a day. I think it's still £150 a day, and it's been £150 a day for as long as I can remember. It doesn't change. And yeah, I was probably the best, most well-paid MVP chair in the country at that time, I think, but at the same time it didn't always feel to me like I was actually well paid. Laura was right, it was possible to achieve things, and we did achieve some things. Preparing for this, I was looking back at some of the annual reports, and yeah, that was a small thing I saw, that service users told us they'd like to know the names of the midwives who'd be providing their antenatal care, and the community midwifery team made changes to their letters as a result of that, so people would know the names of the midwives, and they also put the name of the midwife on the clinic door. So sometimes it was just small things like that that might actually make a difference for someone. And then sometimes it was something a bit, maybe this felt a bit bigger. This was, we put together a training event for GPs on infant feeding, and the person you can see standing up at the front of the room there is Louise Santhanam, another amazing woman who set up the GP Infant Feeding Network. She's a local GP, local to us here in Bromley, and we worked with her with the MVP and with our local commissioner and the public health team in the local authority, and we set up this event, which was brilliant. Although it was also quite a challenging day, because we'd made really clear in the run up to it that this could not be sponsored by any formula companies, because none of us would, as professionals, as me as a breastfeeding counsellor or her as a GP, you know, it would go against all our professional codes to participate in something if it was sponsored by a formula company. And we got there on the day, and lo and behold, it was sponsored by a list of companies, including Danone, which is a formula company, and we had to make a split decision whether to go ahead with the event or to cancel it, and we decided to go ahead. But I was like ringing NCT saying, can I do this? Is this okay for me to do this? So it was quite challenging, but it led to some good conversations afterwards, and it did, the CCG agreed that they would review their sponsorship policy as a result of that. So that perhaps was something positive that came from it. And this was something else positive we were able to achieve, which was to find a new venue for the health visitor clinic when the transition from one provider to another had not been managed very well, and the new provider didn't have access to the old venue. And we were getting complaints about this on our Facebook page, and we were able to find a new venue for the health visitor clinic that was recommended by local mothers. And we approached the vicar and in this church, and he was really happy to have the health visitor clinic there. So we were able to sort that out. So sometimes we were able to actually like do something practical that actually helped us solve a problem, and that was always really satisfying. So something else was going on for me during this period, which was, you remember, I had introduced myself to Ayala Ockett at the MVP Development Day in London, and Ayala then, after I'd been MVP chair for about a year, she got in touch with me and said, was I interested in joining the Better Breastfeeding team, because she was looking for someone who could help to set up an advocates network of people around the country who could help to map their local services and to advocate for better breastfeeding support. And I think she was quite surprised, because I just went straight back and was like, yes, I want to do this. I want to do this, because this was the kind of thing I'd been wanting to do, to get involved nationally and better in like breastfeeding policy and that sort of thing. So I really didn't think about this for very long. I just said yes, and this was not a paid role. I wasn't being offered any money. It was a volunteer role. But yeah, to me, it was just something I really wanted to do, even though I was already quite busy, and I just took this on as an extra thing. And we started inviting all people in our networks to join this, and we sort of networked them. We had a spreadsheet, so we knew who was in what LMS it was then, local maternity system area. And we were kind of networking people within each LMS. And we also started applying for funding to see if we could get some of this work paid for. And to do that, we had to set up a company. So I think that was the first time that I became a director of a company, and it was a company limited by guarantee, which means that any money we make goes back into the company for the purpose of improving breastfeeding support. So I think that's what I should cover there, because I know I'm short of time. So when we Maternity Voices, it all felt like it was going so well, and we got all these, positive comments from people around the country who were looking to us as this kind of lead MVP to follow. But there was a weakness in our Maternity Voices Partnership, and the weak point was that our CCG commissioner was not convinced by the model that we had. And the result of that was that in summer 2018, when I'd been in the role for about a year and a half, I was called into a meeting and told that basically they'd agreed with Healthwatch that Healthwatch were going to take over the Maternity Voices Partnership. I would be out of a role from the beginning of the next financial year. The budget was all being given to Healthwatch, and there was no discussion to be had. There was no point sending any comments or anything, and it became clear that they weren't intending to pay the MVP chair anything. They thought that it could be a voluntary role. Why did that happen? I think their stated reasons were that they didn't think we were reaching a diverse enough range of mothers, which I think up to a point they had a point, which was that our volunteer group were not that diverse. But I don't think they actually had the information to know about the mothers that we were hearing from, because we weren't gathering that data. And actually, as one of the people who did walk the patch, I know we did hear from quite a diverse range of mothers. And also, as chair, I had done quite a bit of work to try and reach out to different groups, and we had started to make progress with that. So I would dispute to some extent that reason. And they also I think we're concerned about falling foul of tax regulations, which is something that's been an issue for MVP chairs up and down the country, that they were concerned that I was invoicing them as a kind of independent contractor, and that really what I was doing was more like a job, and they were worried about that it wasn't being done in the right way. So by outsourcing it to Healthwatch, that kind of passed that problem to them. But I think, so those would have been their stated reasons. I think there was also probably a lack of understanding about the nature of the MVP and the partnership working involved, and also the value of having a critical friend, which is how we saw ourselves at the MVP. So I think there were multiple reasons why that happened, but obviously that was quite a difficult thing. It was a difficult thing for me to experience, and we tried to challenge it, and we got a bit of progress. They agreed to pay the new MVP chair to some extent, but eventually I stepped down from that role in January 2019, and Healthwatch took over the MVP. So that was quite tricky, but I'm not a religious person particularly, but I do quite like the sound of music. And so when I think about this moment in my life, I always think about this phrase, that where the Lord closes a door, somewhere he opens a window. And someone somewhere was looking down on me, because through all that period, I'd been having a lot of conversations with people nationally about what was going on and what could be done about the situation. And one of the people who I spoke to suggested that there could be a role for me nationally, because Laura James of Bromley MVP fame had moved on to National Maternity Voices. She was chairing that committee, but she was stepping down from that role, and they were looking for a new chair. and it was suggested to me that I put myself forward. So I applied for that role, and I was very fortunate to be selected by the committee to take it on. That was a fantastic opportunity for me. Daunting again, taking over from Laura James, and also daunting because the other members of that committee were the founding members. They were the MVP chairs who'd stepped forward to create this new organisation, and they'd created this organisation to advocate for local Maternity Voices partnerships. And I was stepping in. I hadn't been one of those who'd stepped forward. I was just coming in and to chair their meetings, and that felt quite like, who am I to do this? But I was very fortunate that the people I met there were so supportive and lovely, and also our colleagues in NHS England were also really supportive, and so it was just a great relief to be able to work somewhere where having got quite difficult locally, this was just really an amazing opportunity. And again, my role involved chairing meetings and doing some meeting admin. I had this amazing opportunity to sit on Stakeholder Council, which was a little bit like a national Maternity Voices Partnership, not exactly the same, but it was there to monitor progress of the maternity transformation programme, and it was chaired by Julia Cumberledge. That's a photo that I took of her there. And that was amazing, and really I got to meet so many interesting people doing that. And I remember Baroness Cumberledge coming up to me after about my second meeting and saying, I can see that you stand up for women, because I'd started to get confident, like putting my hand up and saying things in the meetings, and I felt very honoured by that. And she started to give me roles as well, to like have the opportunity to lead groups within the meeting and that sort of thing. And I was hugely grateful for that. We also worked with NHS England to organise webinars and national calls for MVP chairs, and this was one that we did where Jacqueline Dunkley-Bent spoke, and it was facilitated by Toyin Adeyinka, who was the chair of Lewisham MVP, and this led to Toyin setting up the Nova Network, which was for Black and ethnic minority MVP chairs to be able to get together nationally, and just if they might have felt isolated locally, to be able to share that with each other and talk about things together. And because I was on Stakeholder Council, I then suggested to Baroness Cumberledge that perhaps the Nova Network could nominate some reps to be on Stakeholder Council, which was great, because then we had a Black and an Asian MVP chair actually coming to those Stakeholder Council meetings as well. I also had a role in advocating for MVP chairs, and this is something that was discussed quite often. To what extent could National Maternity Voices really have a representative role? And some people didn't think that we could, but it was kind of obvious to me that in this situation I found myself in, I had to try and speak for MVP chairs, because I had been one and I could see what was going on through our Facebook group, what was happening locally. And I had these opportunities working with NHS England and on Stakeholder Council. And I'd say the thing that I feel had the biggest impact that I was able to do was to get the wording changed in the NHS Resolution Maternity Incentive Scheme, which was a kind of scheme for trusts with safety actions that they were expected to meet. And one of the actions they had to meet was around co-production. And when I came into this, it was quite vague, the wording. It just kind of said they had to act on feedback from, for example, a Maternity Voices Partnership. And we actually managed to get wording into that was that they had to get written confirmation from the service user chair of the Maternity Voices Partnership that they're being remunerated for their work. And then the following year it was strengthened even further, that written confirmation from the service user chair that they're being remunerated as agreed, and that this remuneration reflects the time commitment and requirements of the role given the agreed work programme. So this was being strengthened continually, and this happened because I was there on the outside making a clear case for this, but also because the person that I was dealing with in NHS England was listening, and that person was Jacqueline Dunkley-Bent, who was the Chief Midwifery Officer, and she was amazing. When I contacted her about this, she rang me straight back and we had a conversation, and then I wrote to her and she responded saying, your points are logical and well made, and I will take this forward. And it was quite brave of her to do that. She didn't need to do that. And so I think often when change happens, it's when you've got someone on the outside and someone on the inside who are both working together. And that was the case there. And I think it made a difference, and it was slow. It wasn't as fast as anyone would have liked it to be, but we did see improvements in MVP funding. And I know that work's continued. This is the bit I've given you because this is about my journey, but I know other people have taken this forward, and that wording has been further strengthened. And now we're looking at MVP chairs starting to be properly employed and getting a proper wage for the work that they do. So I'm really pleased to see that happening. This is another thing we were able to do. NHS England wanted to do a service user voice event, and I suggested that we did it as an unconference because that was something I'd heard about, a format that I'd heard about, and I thought it could work really well in this context. And it was really exciting. And that you can see I'm there with the microphone with Lisa Ramsey, who for some time has been the service user voice policy lead at NHS England, and we ran that together. It was kind of scary, and it wasn't all plain sailing. There were some things we learnt from it that we would do differently another time, but it was really exciting. And it was a format where you set the agenda on the day. So rather than giving people an agenda, the participants set the agenda, and you can see on the wall, this was like where we kind of set the agenda, and we had all these slots in different rooms, and it was really dynamic, and meant it was led by the participants. So we were really pleased with that, and I was pleased with how that went. So we the next phase for National Maternity Voices, up until that point it had been a committee, and I'd been chairing the committee, but we got to a point where we were getting more public funds, and we needed to be an official organisation, and we also needed to elect our committee rather than just being these initial volunteers who'd come forward. So at that point I stepped down as the chair, and we formed a company, and I agreed to become one of 5 directors of that company so that we would have some continuity. I was hugely grateful to Louise Grew, who I believe is here in this meeting, and because she had done a huge amount of work to set up the community interest company, and the directors agreed that Louise would be the managing director of that new company, and I agreed to become the Maternity Voices Partnership support manager. We also held elections for the committee, and the amazing Zainab Barry was elected as the chair of the new committee. And I've included a picture of her there because I worked quite a lot with her, in fact, over the following year. And so in this role, I was responding to queries relating to MVPs, and I also led on some specific projects. And the most significant, I think, of those projects was developing the Maternity Voices Partnerships Toolkit. And I've included an image there. You can see that on the National Maternity Voices website. That was something I worked on with Zainab, and we brought together a really diverse group of people to work on that toolkit, and we had a lot of discussions together. I then drafted that toolkit, and it was a real opportunity for me to bring together everything that I'd done locally and nationally, and all the knowledge that we had brought together as a group. That was something that was commissioned from National Maternity Voices by NHS England. And I believe that you can still access that on the National Maternity Voices website, although some things have moved on since we published that. So having completed that work, I then thought that it was probably time for me to start stepping back from National Maternity Voices and make way for new, more recent MVP chairs to get involved. So I started to do that. And as I did that, I was then able to put a bit more time into Better Breastfeeding. So that was something that had taken a back seat for me while I was at National Maternity Voices. But my colleague Ayala had very much continued to develop things at Better Breastfeeding. She had Better Breastfeeding had been commissioned by North Central London to develop a breastfeeding strategy, and Ayala had done that brilliantly. And she had also worked with other organisations on developing a breastfeeding alliance, and she'd also done some national influencing work which had been very effective, getting additional resources for infant feeding locally, and getting commitments for local authorities and LMNSs to develop infant feeding strategies. So my role during that time had really been advisory. I'd had regular calls with Ayala and we talked things through, but she had been doing all of that work. But at this point, I was able to get a bit more involved again. So some of the things that I started to be able to do were to get involved with the Breastfeeding Alliance, and I've been for some time now chairing the Breastfeeding Alliance meetings, which of course I was able to draw on all that experience of chairing meetings that I'd gained through the MVPs. Ayala and I have run webinars for local authority and LM&S staff on national policy relating to breastfeeding and on how to develop a breastfeeding or infant feeding strategy. And we've also started to take on consultancy work directly for local authorities or for LM&Ss. And what I've included on this slide is the project that I've been working on the second half of last year and the first part of this year, which has been a really big project to develop an infant feeding strategy for Kent. And that was commissioned by Kent County Council, and there you can see the draft strategy that went out for consultation. So I did loads of work for this, surveying local mothers in Kent and also staff, interviewing all the infant feeding leads, and organising some co-production events and then drafting this strategy. And this went out to consultation, and I was then the person who was analysing all the consultation responses that came in and making recommendations to Kent County Council about any changes that needed to be made. So that was like really a new experience for me. I've been on the other side lots of times responding to consultations, but I'd never been the person doing that analysis. So that's been really interesting for me. And finally, after 16 years, I'm being paid a consultancy rate rather than patient public voice rate. So that is also very exciting. Although I must emphasise that this is after having really built something up and having done a lot of voluntary work to build up better breastfeeding. And also it's not a secure income. It's only as secure as our next project, because this is just a small business really that we're running, and the funding that we get from any consultancy work we're putting into the unfunded parts of our work, like we're now the Secretariat for the Breastfeeding Alliance, which is not funded. So this is now the main thing that I'm working on, which is brilliant. And that's pretty much it from me. This is just a photo I took on one of our family trips. We do a lot of travelling around by train, and it seemed relevant for this webinar that happiness is a journey and not a destination. Who knows where I'm going to end up in the future? I have no idea, but I'm enjoying the journey. And so, yeah, I've put this slide for reflections, but I know I've taken up too much time. So I think probably I should hand over to all of you for reflections and Q&A.
That was a fantastic journey to hear about, so thank you so much for that. So I'll just stop recording, and then we'll move on to Q&A. If you want to turn your cameras back on as well. Yeah.